All right, so let's get going on today's class. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to finish up our look at simple mechanisms of learning, starting with the opponent process theory of emotion. So we introduced this last time, and as you recall, this is a theory that was trying to explain the after effects of strong emotional experiences, and the after effects are typically the opposite emotion. So if you just felt great sadness, once that stimulus is gone, you'll feel happy. If you just felt scared for your life, once that stimulus is gone, you will feel bravery like never before. So it's typically the opposite emotion. And as I mentioned, this is a trope that has been used in many romantic comedies. And even though the plot lines of many of these comedies might seem ludicrous, that idea that boy meets girl, boy and girl don't get along, but then later on they fall in love, has some merit to it in terms of this opponent process theory of emotion. So we include it in this section because it does use habituation-like and sensitization-like properties. So we'll break it down for a sort of textbook case, and then we'll apply it to the rom-coms. All right. So here we have a graph showing your reactions to a particular stimulus. So here on the x-axis we got time, so this is earlier, and then later, 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 later. And then here on the y-axis we have your heart rate. So this is a normal heart rate, right about there. That's your resting heart rate, for example. Up here, increased heart rate. Down here, decreased heart rate. And where that dotted line begins, that is when you are getting shocked. So in this case, you're having a shock applied to your arm, and that is going to cause your heart rate to react. It's going to cause your heart rate to increase. Now, what occurs is this net result here. So this net result, this is what your heart is actually doing. You'll start off with an increase in the heart rate because you're getting shocked. And then you'll see a little bit of a decrease, and then it'll kind of stabilize out. So it starts with an increase, and while the shock is still going, you're still kind of being, it'll be a little bit of a decrease, and then it'll kind of steady out. And what's going on here is that when you get shocked, you have an A process, an elicited behavior, a reaction that's known as the A process, and that's your body's natural reaction to this shock. Your body's natural reaction to a shock is to increase your heart rate. However, at that same time, your body does not like its heart rate to be increased. Your body likes to achieve what's known as homeostasis. It likes to have things just the way that they are. That's why when you overheat, your body starts sweating so that you can cool down. So you try to achieve homeostasis, and as soon as your A process kicks in, your body naturally kicks in what's known as the B process. And the B process tries to counteract the A process. So the A process says, whoa, we're getting shocked. Let's increase our heart rate like crazy. And then your B process says, oh man, my heart rate is really high. Let me try to bring it down. I'm going to bring down my heart rate as much as I can. And you can see that the net result is the addition of those two. So up for the A process, down for the B process, and that results in this net heart rate that you experience. Now, one thing to notice about the B process, two characteristics of it. Number one, it's smaller than the A process. You can't bring down your heart rate to the point where there's nothing, or it's right back to its normal resting state. And then the second thing is that it takes a little bit longer to kick in, right? So your heart rate goes up high, and then kind of is brought down by that B process. So it takes a little bit longer to kick in. And then also what happens is that once the shock stops, so here we have shock on, over here we have shock off. So once that shock stops, your A process very quickly goes away. Your body very quickly goes, when the shock is on, it's like, zzz, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm being shocked, heart rate up, heart rate up. And then when it stops, zzz, your body's like, oh, it's off. Okay, heart rate back to normal. So the A process is very quick to be turned on, turned off. but the B process is slower. So what actually happens in some is that when the shock occurs, you see a rapid increase in heart rate, followed by a slight decrease in heart rate. So then we get this kind of stable. Then when the shock is turned off, we see a decrease in heart rate, and it actually overshoots the mark. It actually goes below your normal heart rate and then comes back up. And that overshooting is because of the B process. It just takes longer for this B process that tried to slow everything down. It takes longer for it to come to turn off. So that's what would happen the first time you get shocked. The second time you get shocked, the third time you get shocked, I don't know why you're getting shocked so much, but anyways, all these times that you get shocked, what happens is that your A process basically stays the same, but your B process gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So the 20th time that you get shocked, your A process stays the same, but your B process gets much stronger. So now your B process has basically been working out, and it can pull down your heart rate very efficiently. So now you get a very small spike, a very small net result, because again, how much heart rate you have is the A process and the B process, considered together. You got the A process increasing, you got the B process bringing it down. So you'll see now that when you get shocked, it's very low in terms of the net result. And when your shock stops, your heart rate would go way down because your B process is so strong, and then eventually it'll come back up to its normal state. So incidentally, one of the areas where they actually do use this technique of training is in the military. If you ever see, SEAL training, Navy SEAL training or anything like that, where they're running into the cold water, and doing push-ups in the ocean, and they run back out, and then they run back in and they do push-ups in the ocean. What they're doing is they're working on this B process. They're working on that process to fight the feelings of cold, to fight that feeling of shock, and that's why eventually they'll run in there and they're like, man, I don't even feel the cold anymore. I can't believe I was ever so sensitive to this before. It's just the way that you get to that level of that result. So, A process, very fast, stays the same during training. B process, slower, gets stronger during training. So what does this mean for our rom-com? Well, your body tries to maintain homeostasis on everything, right? So your body doesn't like to be over-emotional. Your body doesn't like to be too hot, doesn't like to be too cold. It tries to maintain homeostasis on everything. So it will also try to maintain homeostasis on feelings. So now on the y-axis here, we have neutral right there. Neutral is when you see something you're like, I don't love it, I don't hate it. I look at this table, like it's a table, I'm neutral. Up here we got feelings of hate. It's when you see something you're like, hate that thing. And down here we got feelings of love. So this is what happens typically, or the psychology explanation for rom-coms. Because what happens initially is we have girl meets boy, and girl meets boy for the first time. And they're always in a situation where the boy has done something or the girl has done something that annoys the other person, right? So they've stolen their taxi cab, or, they get assigned to a news report that they wanted to be assigned to. I can't believe this happened. Anyways, feelings of hate occur when girl meets boy. And then the entire time that they're in that interaction together, the entire time they're in that same office, and the editor is saying, well, I'm giving Jimmy here the story. And it's like, no, I've been working so hard for that story. It's my story. I hate them. The whole time that they're in that office, you have this feelings of hate being elicited by this stimulus. Well, then what happens is that stimulus goes away, right? The boy leaves. He's away somewhere. And once that stimulus is gone, those emotions of hate start to dissipate. And they actually, because of this opponent process, overshoot the mark to the point where now the person would be saying, well, I really hated them when I first met them, but maybe they're not that bad of a person. Until they get back up to the point where they're like, I don't think of them one way or the other. So we have intense hate followed by mild liking. And again, this is the A process working when the girl first meets boy in these rom-coms. So you have the A process where they took something, they did something, something was annoyed. Now they really have those feelings of hate. But once again, your A process is always counteracted by a B process. And that first time, your B process is actually kind of weak. It's saying to itself, you know what, we got these feelings of hate coming out of our body. This is no good. I want to go back to neutral. Let me try to pull it down a little bit with the opposite emotion. Pull it down a little bit with love. Not successful the first time that they meet, but then again, slow to turn off. And you have a sort of like, after the person leaves, you're like, oh, I can't believe that person. You know, but maybe they weren't so bad. Girl meets boy for the first time. They don't just meet once, right? There's a series of events. They're put together at the hotel room. They're going on a conference, whatever it is. They interact with each other a bunch of times. And what happens is that eventually, after girl meets boy for the 20th time, sure, he still annoys her, and that A process is still going strong. They're still the same person. So the A process is going strong, but by now, that B process has been working out. It's gotten very strong. It's gotten very much able to pull down those feelings of hate. And then what always happens is at one point, before the female character realizes her intense feelings for this individual, they are accepting a job in another state. They need to go away on a very dangerous mission to some news report somewhere. So they're on their way to the airport. So that stimulus gets removed. Boy is no longer there. Stimulus gets removed. And that's where the girl character realizes, after losing the boy for the 20th time, oh my gosh, I love him so much. Oh my gosh, I have to run to the airport, get in that cab, stop him before I make the mistake of my life. And that's where you get the mad dash to the airport. And this is where the movie ends, right? The mad dash at the airport. She makes it in time, and they're in love. That's typically where the movie ends. What they don't do, outside of one example, is show you what happens afterwards, where after that B process wears off, at this point, the woman is like, I think I might have to rethink my life decision here, and maybe he's not everything that I thought of. So if you are looking for a movie that shows that final coming back to neutral, you can check out They Came Together. It's kind of a send-up of all the rom-coms, but it basically shows that part of it. It shows what happens after the trip to the airport and the last-minute feelings of love. But again, you can see that this opponent process theory can explain why, even in real life, first person you meet somebody, you might be like, man, I can't stand that person. They're horrible. And then after you meet them over and over and over again, your feelings for them change. And you might even fall in love. Maybe not, but you'll definitely be able to tolerate that person. They won't get under your skin quite as much. And again, that's your B process hanging out. And then when you talk, when you're discussing them with your friends about what happened at work, you'll be in this portion of it where you'll say, maybe they're not so bad. I'm kind of feeling a lot of B process for them right now. Maybe it's not so bad. All right, so before we wrap this up, just a little aside. It's a little pet peeve of mine. I don't know why they do this. This is not Paul Rudd, and this is not Amy Poehler, but they put the names. It's just a little thing that gets to me. It's getting my A process going. That poster wasn't that bad. All right, so we include this here because the A process and the B process, you can think of them as sensitization-like and habituation-like. So the A process is kind of like sensitization-like. You keep presenting the stimulus, and you keep having that high reaction. That's the part of this that is like a sensitization process, where you present a stimulus, and your reaction to it goes higher and higher and higher. Fighting that sensitization process is a habituation-like process, and that's your B process. So every single time that you meet somebody, your reaction to them, or that you're presented with a stimulus, the B process is making your reaction lower and lower and lower. So this opponent process theory uses basically a sensitization-like A process which is counteracted by a habituation-like B process where your reaction gets less and less as you go on. All right, so that's our wrap-up of last class. Any questions on this or comments before we move on? All righty. So what we're going to do now is we're going to continue our look at Chapter 3, but specifically we're now going to turn to classical conditioning. So for the rest of today, we're going to take a look at classical conditioning, and we're going to use it to analyze something that is used to change a lot of people's behaviors, something that is definitely involves principles of learning. We're going to take a look at advertisements. So 9 out of 10 people, if you ask them, do advertisements work on you? They will say, no, they don't. And 9 out of 10 people are wrong. Advertisements work on everyone. And, you know, they can be very effective, like what Nike's finding out right now. But we're going to take a look at why ads look the way that they are and what processes, how do they work? How do they make you want to buy a product? So previously, advertisements actually didn't work very well. So this is an example of an old-timey Coca-Cola ad. And what you'll notice is that in a lot of these old ads, they always mentioned features of the product. They were always trying to convince you of the quality of their product. So for this one, Coke follows thirst everywhere. It's trying to tell you, it doesn't matter where you go, there's going to be a Coke machine there. You know, you can find our product anywhere that you go. And then this one over here, you can see is trying to tell you how healthy Coke is and that it's you know, recommended by the medical association. You got a nurse that is saying, yeah, this is an excellent choice. It's not. But anyways, quality you can trust. It was very much about the features of the product. It's everywhere. Quality you can trust. Great taste. That's what they used to think convinced people to make purchases. Lately, though, they don't do that anymore. So this was a campaign a few years back, and it's telling you to try to live on the Coke side of life, you know, whatever that means, right? But this was an effective ad campaign, but nowhere is any features of Coke, nowhere is the quality or taste or ingredients that you can find. It's not about the features, it's about a feeling. They're trying to create a feeling with this ad. And one of the most influential ads of all time actually was also specifically trying to do this for Coke. So Coca-Cola, if you've watched Mad Men, you'll know about this one, had one of the most influential, successful ad campaigns of all time. And again, does not mention any of the features of Coke.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honeybees and snow white turtle doves. I like to teach the world to sing with me. I like to buy the world a home and keep it company. I like to keep the world safe.
All right. Oh yeah, no, we're not doing it again. There we go. All right. But you can see nothing about the taste of Coke, right? But it's all about a feeling. It's about, you know, we're all together in this world. It's one of the most diverse commercials I've ever seen. And it was hugely successful. Coke sales went up. And again, nothing about the product, all about, you know, the feeling. Who doesn't like love and rainbows and apple trees and honeybees? They're getting rarer though, so they're going to go up in liking. But anyways, all things that they like. Why would they make it look like this? Why is this effective? And then the last example I'll give you, once again, we'll go back to Coke. You've probably heard this saying that sex sells, right? When you're doing advertising, sex sells. Sex is the one thing that, you know, will always sell. You just slap a good-looking body on an advertisement, and it'll be effective. And to a degree, they're correct. But again, the question is why? So why would commercials like this one here actually be effective in selling Cokes? Oh, you gotta be kidding me. One moment. All right. Well, we'll see if it'll work. I'll give it one last shot. If you haven't seen this before, oh, that's the one I was looking for. No, not that one. This was supposed to be smooth. It was supposed to be easy. All right. I like this one because it's the gender bender. Of course, by now, if you were looking at the screen, you would have seen it. This is not the commercial. This is the commercial. All right. So, oh my goodness, how many? Can we see another? No. Okay, here we go. Enjoy. All right, so why is that effective, right? No rational person, oh, and you can tell what my son watches to learn Spanish. All right, so no rational person would ever look at that and go, you know what, I bet you what we need to do if we want to meet some hunky guys is we'll just hang out where they drink Coke and they'll be there. Nobody thinks that, and yet it's an effective advertisement. So take a look at why advertisements look the way they do, why those are effective, and we'll also take a look at why people are scared of wasps and bees for good reason, because they've been stung before. So how many people here, show of hands, have been stung by wasps and bees? All right, most. How many people here have aversive feelings towards wasps and bees? They're an aversive stimulus, something that you try to avoid. Okay, most people. How many people have the same aversive feelings to a spider? How many people try to avoid spiders? All right, and how many people have been bitten by a spider? Okay, that question almost always backfires in the end. But more people have been stung by bees than have been bitten by spiders. And yet everybody is still afraid of bees and afraid of spiders. So it's very easy to understand why you might be afraid of bees if you've been stung before. It's painful. Of course you're going to be afraid of them. But there are people who have never been bitten by a spider, and yet they're still afraid of spiders. It's still an aversive stimulus. So how can we explain that kind of bizarre reaction? Well, it's all going to be when we take a look at classical conditioning. So we are going to take a look at the basic procedures and definitions involved in classical conditioning. We're going to use them to explain the effectiveness of advertising. And then we're going to take a look at the temporal arrangement of stimuli. So you got two important stimuli in classical conditioning, and depending upon how they're arranged, you can get different effects. All right, so classical conditioning, it's also known as Pavlovian conditioning, after Pavlov, the first scientist to discover it. It's also known as respondent conditioning. We're only going to use the term classical conditioning here in this course, but in your future readings, if you come across Pavlovian conditioning, if you come across respondent conditioning, it's exactly the same thing. Don't get confused. It's classical conditioning. And classical conditioning has certain situations, and to communicate those situations so everybody knows what they're talking about, they have certain diagrams and certain terms, certain notation. So we'll just introduce that notation here. So they got the colon, and the colon indicates two events that occur in sequence. So one event occurs, and then the other event occurs. So for example, if you write bell, food, that means that you present the bell, and then you present the food. It's just two events that happen in sequence, one after the other. There's another term or notation, it's that arrow there. And this is when the first event actually causes the second event. So the first event causes the second event to occur. And if you have bell arrow salivation, what that means is that the bell is actually causing the salivation. So in the first case with the colon, the bell didn't cause the food, right? A bell doesn't cause food. You ring the bell, you show the food. But in this case, what this is indicating is that the bell is actually causing salivation. And then the final little bit of notation is italics. And italics are reserved for the behavior that is being conditioned. This is the target behavior. This is the behavior that is being trained. This is the behavior that is being learned. This is the behavior that's being conditioned. So if we wrote bell arrow salivation, bell arrow means that the bell caused the salivation. Salivation in italics means that it's the target behavior. All right, so we're going to be using that notation for a while. We're going to camp out on classical conditioning. It's one of the two major forms of learning. And we're going to get very familiar with this dog right here. So we're going to go through the basic procedure of classical conditioning using the original ringing a bell, presenting food, salivation occurs. So we'll use that to go through, and then we'll apply that idea to advertising. So what do we have here? So we start off, and this is before conditioning. This is the first day the dog walks into the lab. Right? This is a naive dog, never been in this lab before, maybe never heard a bell before, doesn't know anything, hasn't learned anything. This is a completely new, naive dog. And on that first day of training, before he's being conditioned, if you give this dog food, that dog will salivate. So something that occurs before conditioning means that you're dealing with two specific stimuli, two specific events. Number one, you're dealing with food, which is called the US. Salivation is called the UR, and that's the last time you're going to hear me call those by their abbreviation. And do not read these as their abbreviation. So UR, try to read that as unconditioned response. So the U for unconditioned, the R for response. Do not talk about it as the UR in your head. Do not mentally read it as the UR. In your readings, in class, every single time you see it, get into the habit, unconditioned response. You're going to see there's a lot of terms. This is going to help you learn those so that you don't get confused. So the unconditioned response is just that. It's a natural response. It's a response that hasn't been conditioned. First day in the lab, this dog is salivating to food. Nobody taught it to salivate to food. Unconditioned response. Similarly, because it caused the unconditioned response, that food is an unconditioned stimulus. So again, nobody had to train the dog to salivate the food. The food is unconditioned. It's a stimulus that causes the response, but it's an unconditioned stimulus. So before conditioning, before anything, we have, in this case, food, the unconditioned stimulus, causes salivation, the unconditioned response. So far, so good? All right. Also before conditioning, we have another stimulus, and this is the bell. And the bell causes no salivation. So it does not cause the target response. Right? That's what we're interested in, the salivation. That's the target behavior. So what we classify the bell as is the bell is a NS, standing for neutral stimulus. So it's a neutral stimulus because it does not cause the target behavior. So you ring the bell, and the dog might look around, and the dog might perk up its ears, but the dog is not salivating. The bell is neutral. It does not cause salivation. So that's all before conditioning. That's what's happening to the dog before any training happens whatsoever. So then what they do to do the classical conditioning is they start presenting the bell, ding, 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 and then they present the food, you know, here's some meat, and then they measure what happens with the dog, and the dog starts salivating. So during the early phases of conditioning, trial 1, 2, 3, what will happen is the bell, again, paired with the food is causing the salivation. So at this stage, the bell is a neutral stimulus, the food is an unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation is an unconditioned response. So UR, unconditioned response, the food is the US, unconditioned stimulus, and the bell is the NS, neutral stimulus. And as you can see right now, nothing's happened yet, right? Before training, the bell was neutral. During the early phases, it's still neutral. Before training, the food was unconditioned stimulus. During the early training, it's still unconditioned. Same thing with the salivation, stayed as an unconditioned response. But what you do is you keep presenting this to the dog over and over and over again. You ring the bell, here's some food, you measure salivation. You ring the bell, here's some food, you measure salivation. You ring the bell, here's some food, you measure salivation. And what eventually happens later is that bell will change from a neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. So this is the key change. This is the learning that is occurring in classical conditioning. The unconditioned response of salivation stays the same. So the unconditioned response is still an unconditioned response. The dog is still salivating to the unconditioned stimulus, which is food. However, at this point, later in the training, later in the conditioning, that bell has changed from a neutral stimulus to a CS, what's known as a conditioned stimulus. So all the learning in classical conditioning is when you go from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus. That change is the learning, changing that bell from a neutral to a conditioned stimulus. So at this point, we can't tell that the bell has become a conditioned stimulus because while the dog is salivating, it's salivating in response to the food. It's salivating in response to that unconditioned stimulus. So the way that we test if conditioning has actually occurred is we ring that bell by itself, and if it causes salivation, if it now causes the target behavior, then we can say that the conditioned stimulus, the bell, has now caused the CR, or conditioned response. So it's very important at this point, even though salivation was the unconditioned response, when it occurs to the bell, it's a conditioned response because it's occurring to a conditioned stimulus. And it's important to keep that distinction because, as we're going to see later, sometimes the conditioned response is exactly the same as the unconditioned response. Sometimes it's different. So we have to maintain that distinction. We've got to be very clear on that. So the unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response. The conditioned stimulus causes the conditioned response. And this is the evidence of learning. The bell used to do nothing. Through classical conditioning, there's now a change where the bell has become a conditioned response, conditioned stimulus causing the conditioned response. Incidentally, if you ever go to a learning conference, or you talk to somebody, or you overhear a conversation between two people who specialize in learning, their conversations are often like, oh, so I took the CS and it caused a CER, but then the US was paired with an NS, and we found out that it, after this, and they're like, oh, the CS, the US, and it's literally like that. Don't do that to yourselves right now. I'm not even at that stage because I don't practice it every single day. Read this out: conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. All right. So, any questions on the basic procedure? Okay, let's apply this to advertising. So we're going to first start to take a look at old-timey advertisements. What happened before? What were advertisements like in the old days? And what was it that they made a mistake about in terms of advertising? So let's take a look at an old-timey advertisement here for Kool-Aid. It is creepy, so just get ready for it. But here we go. Oh, all right, real quick. Notice what they're doing here. They're showing Kool-Aid, and they're talking about features. Showing Kool-Aid, talking about features, right? So Kool-Aid, taste that kids love. Kool-Aid makes 9 quarts of. Kool-Aid. So notice that they keep doing that. Kool-Aid and then features.
Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid.
Oh, the very best drink you ever made.
Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid.
Be sure that the envelope says
Kool-Aid.
You can give your youngsters a lot of pleasure with Kool-Aid. It's pure and good. It has the Paris Magazine seal. And it's so thrifty. A 5-cent package makes 2 full quarts. Just add Kool-Aid to water with ice. Add some sugar and stir.
For the very best drink you ever made.
Be sure that the envelope says
Kool-Aid.
All right. So yeah, so back then, if you did want to give your children lots of pleasure, you would buy them some Kool-Aid. So let's take a look at what was going on there. And importantly, notice how many times they were like, Kool-Aid makes 9 quarts of Kool-Aid, parental magazine seal of approval. They kept showing the Kool-Aid package, and they kept showing they kept mentioning the features. So why were they doing this? Well, what is the unconditioned stimulus? It's all classical conditioning and advertising. So what are they trying to do? Well, one thing that they wanted to do is they wanted to cause rational thinking. So they thought rational thinking is what drives consumer behavior. Consumers take a look at products, they decide which product is the best, which one fits their lifestyle the best, do price analyses. Basically, they come rationally to a decision about what it is that they want to buy. And something that causes rational thinking is information. So just to give you a simple example of this, if I say something like 2 plus 2 is, everybody in here immediately is like 4, right? You almost can't stop it when people give you information. You start to think about that information. You start to think rationally. So in this case, before conditioning, before any commercial was ever seen about Kool-Aid, if you were presented with info, that's the unconditioned stimulus, and that information leads to rational thinking. Much the same way as if I say 2 plus 2 and you're like, oh, that's 4. So that's before conditioning. Also before conditioning, before anybody has ever seen a Kool-Aid commercial, the Kool-Aid package would be a neutral stimulus in the sense that it would not lead to any rational thinking. So if you were to show adults that Kool-Aid packet back in the day and said, hey, take a look at this package, what does it make you think? They would not come up with any rational thinking. They would not come up with any ideas about, there's quality, there's this features, there's that features. They would basically take a look at it and go, it's a package, it holds stuff. That's kind of where I'm at right now. Neutral stimulus, doesn't do anything. That's what the Kool-Aid package was beforehand. So what do? Well, they start running the ads. And what the ad does is it pairs that Kool-Aid package with information, and the information leads to rational thinking. So the Kool-Aid package, once again, is a neutral stimulus. And you present the Kool-Aid package, then you present the information. Kool-Aid makes 9 quarts. Kool-Aid, taste your children will love. Kool-Aid, parental magazine seal of approval. Kool-Aid, so thrifty, 5-cent package, right? They kept presenting the stimulus followed by the information. The information is the unconditioned stimulus. That leads to rational thinking, the unconditioned response. So when parents were watching that, specifically moms that would be doing the grocery shopping back then, they would be sitting there going, wow, that is inexpensive. 5 cents, for a gallon or 9 gallons or however much it was. That's pretty inexpensive. And parental magazine seal of approval. Oh, that's really high quality. So they're sitting there and they're doing that rational thinking. As the commercial goes, and upon repeated viewings, when you pair these over and over again, Kool-Aid with the information, Kool-Aid with the information, what happens through classical conditioning is eventually that Kool-Aid package, that packet, turns into a conditioned stimulus. So it changes from its neutral stimulus early on, through repeated viewings of this commercial, it changes into a conditioned stimulus. And then what happens now is this is the place where an advertisement tries to get, because what happens now is that when that information is not present, when you're not watching the commercial, the conditioned stimulus will cause the conditioned response. And where they want you to have that conditioned response is in the supermarket. So when that mother is walking through the supermarket and she's walking into the drink aisle and she's thinking to herself, you know what, I have to choose from all these different types of drinks. Right? I got 12 choices that I can make. Which one should I choose? She's going to take a look at them and she's going to be like, I don't know anything about this one. Neutral stimulus, neutral stimulus, neutral stimulus, Kool-Aid. Parental seal of magazine approval. 5 quarts, 5 cents per quart. It's got a great taste kids love. Rational thinking, I'm going to make that decision. So that's why advertisements used to present information about their products, is because they wanted you, when you got to the supermarket, when you got to the car dealership, when you got to the appliance store, they wanted you to see their logo, see their product, and that product went from being a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus. That conditioned stimulus caused the conditioned response of rational thinking, and then that rational thinking drove your consumer behavior, and you made the decision to choose Kool-Aid out of the other choices, and that's what they thought was behind advertising. All right, so that is the old-timey advertisements. What they found out was that rational thinking does not actually drive consumer behavior. But before we go on to the kind of new style, any questions about that? All right, so it was found that rational thinking does not actually drive most of consumer behavior. That decision to buy something usually does not come down to a rational thought process. So because of that, modern day commercials changed their approach, and they're changing even more now. It was kind of hard to find a modern day example of a Kool-Aid commercial, so I had to go a little bit back. This is like 90s, I think. But anyway, the switch had already been made. So take a look at how different this commercial is compared to the creepy 1950s one that we just saw.
There's all kinds of boxes, but only one box that.
So once again, while you're watching this, notice how often they're even saying it's the box, right? The box. How often they show the box followed by some sort of wacky wild stuff.
Wacky box. Kool-Aid style. Wacky. Oh, wild. Kool-Aid style. Kool-Aid coolers your strength. It's wacky, wild, Kool-Aid style. The box is totally wacky.
All right, it's the box that's totally wacky. Notice how little information he gave you there about the actual product. There was one mention that said a feature about Kool-Aid, and that was that it was juice. That's it. That's all you know about Kool-Aid by the end of this commercial. It's juice, right? But these commercials are way more effective, and it's because of what drives consumer decisions. Does anybody want to take a guess? What do we base our decisions on?
Emotions.
We base our decisions on emotions. Consumer behavior is mostly emotion driven, and all these commercials, what they're trying to do is they are trying to get you to experience, there we go, they're trying to get you to experience a positive emotion when you see their product. So once again, we start before conditioning, before you've ever seen a Kool-Aid commercial, you have an unconditioned stimulus, which is fun, and that leads to a positive emotion, and that is the unconditioned response. So this is seeing other people have fun, typically leads to a positive emotion, the unconditioned response. And this is, we'll see why this is later in the semester, but usually most people, if they see somebody enjoying themselves, they feel a little bit positive themselves. It's rare that you'll have an individual walk by a park filled with children playing and laughing and going, oh, the rest of me. Right? Usually it's kind of like, oh, look at those people having fun. Oh, look at those people over there. So when you see fun, it usually leads to a positive emotion. So we have the unconditioned stimulus of fun causing the unconditioned response of that positive emotion. Once again, before conditioning, before any commercials have been seen, Kool-Aid, the drink box, causes no emotion. So if you were to show somebody the Kool-Aid drink box, they look at it and go, it's blue, kind of like red, but it's all right. I don't hate it. I don't love it. I'm neutral. So the Kool-Aid box leads to a neutral emotion. This is where the advertising comes in. So the advertising starts showing the Kool-Aid box paired with the fun. So notice again how many times in that commercial they showed the box, and then they showed some craziness happening. They showed the box, and you're at the beach. They showed the box, and here's a comic book. They showed the box, and here's dancing kids. It was, box and fun, box and fun, box and fun. And what happens is you see the box. That's the neutral stimulus, the Kool-Aid logo. And then that is followed up by the fun, the dancing, the singing, the beach, the parties, the comic books. And that is causing positive emotions, the unconditioned response. So the Kool-Aid box starts out as a neutral stimulus, followed by the fun, which is an unconditioned stimulus, which causes positive emotion, the unconditioned response. And then after repeated viewings, what they find is that, or what happens, is that the Kool-Aid box goes from being a neutral stimulus to becoming a conditioned stimulus. So now the Kool-Aid box becomes a conditioned stimulus. So once again, conditioned stimulus at the end of the training, paired with the unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response. But importantly now, when that Kool-Aid box is alone, it's a conditioned stimulus, and that Kool-Aid box on its own will lead to a positive emotion, which is now the conditioned response. And it's that conditioned response that they're looking for, that the advertisers want you to have, because they want you in that supermarket, once again, walking along in that supermarket going, oh, look at this myriad of juice box options, juice drinks that are available. And you're looking at one and you're like, eh. And you're looking at another and you're like, hmm. And then you look at the Kool-Aid box and you're like, you know what? I don't know why, but I just kind of have good feelings about this Kool-Aid box. I'm going to pick this up. Of course, you're not saying this to yourself consciously, but you have positive feelings towards it. You're like, I like this thing. I'm going to pick it up. And that's why these advertisements are effective. All right. Any questions about that, comments? It's also interesting to, when you analyze commercials like this, whenever you analyze popular culture, there are tons of clues in there in terms of psychological processes. So back in the 50s, who did they think was making purchasing decisions as far as Kool-Aid goes? The parents. So that first commercial was all for the mother. It was all for that mom that was making those purchasing decisions. Back in the 1950s when she was shopping at the supermarket, they thought that she was the one that decided what brand of drink her family was going to have. Who makes the decisions now? What was that second commercial geared towards? It was geared towards kids. So advertisers also found out that for certain products, parents do not make the decisions, the children do, and that's why you'll have these Kool-Aid commercials specifically aimed at children, because again, they're the ones that make these decisions. So pay attention to that when you're watching commercials. Always try to take a look at, what is it about the commercial that is the the neutral stimulus is usually the product. What's the unconditioned stimulus? And what is the positive emotion that they're trying to elicit? And that's one of the reasons why you'll see cars speeding in car commercials on that closed course. You're never going to do that. Nobody ever thinks that they're going to be jumping building to building when they buy a certain car, but they'll have those commercials. The most ludicrous things happen, nothing to do with the product. It's all about positive emotions. Yep.
When it comes to advertising that's not in video form, how do they make products look appealing to people? Is there some type of product conditioning going on with something like a bag of chips or something do they just do something that we already kind of have conditioning over, like you said, a positive emotion towards something?
Well, you can have it in the actual product itself. So you can actually, if you have people smiling on a bag of chips, right, while they're eating it, again, you have that smile. Smiles elicit positive emotions in us. Usually people don't get angry when they see somebody smile, right? When you see somebody happy, you're like, oh, that kind of brightened my day. So they might actually have it on the product itself. But usually what you'll see is that companies' products will very carefully choose a design, but usually that design is a neutral stimulus. So while the Google logo looks nice, it's just Google in different colors. While the Pepsi logo is that nice red, white, and blue, it really, if you showed it to somebody, they wouldn't be like, whoa, look at that thing. What an amazing piece of art. They're almost basically neutral stimuli. What they do is they associate it with the products. And a great example of that, and their choice for those is can be shown in the new Nike ad. So has anybody seen the new Nike ad with Colin Kaepernick, I think is Kaepernick? All right. So the quarterback, and it has his face, it has the Nike swoosh, and it's got that stand up for what you believe in, even if it costs you everything slogan. And people are having massive reactions to this. Now, most people, or what Nike was hoping was a large proportion of people would have positive reactions toward this. And they would see that image of Colin, and they would say to themselves, you know what, I feel good about the stand you took. I feel good about that. It elicits positive emotions in me. His stimulus is something that is eliciting positive emotions. There's the Nike logo. So that the next time that you go out, you'll actually, when you see the shoes and you're like, which one should I buy? You're more likely to have positive emotions towards Nike, and you'll pick up that pair of shoes. So in any form of advertising, whether it's print, whether it's radio, whether it's video, look for them, having the product or the product name or some way that you can identify the product, and then linking it with things that'll cause positive emotions. And interestingly, they don't get it right all the time, and they're very quick to find out. So the Colin Kaepernick example is one where they got it right for a lot of people, but there's a lot of people who are boycotting Nike right now because they had a negative reaction to that particular thing. So it elicited a negative emotion towards them. Another great example of where they got it wrong was she's one of the Jenners. She did the Pepsi commercial. Is it Kylie, the model? Yeah. Kendall. Was it Kendall? Kendall Jenner did that Pepsi commercial where she apparently stopped police brutality and racism with a Pepsi, right? And it was tone deaf, and people just had the worst reaction to it. And here they thought, oh, we're going to take this, Instagram model star that's famous, that people follow, that seem to enjoy. She's beautiful, so they're like, we have that going for us too. And we'll attach her to a situation where, people have positive feelings about, building bridges and being more inclusive and let's all be friends. But it didn't cause that positive emotion, and it backfired. But that's what they were going for. They were going for that positive emotion, so that when you saw Pepsi, again, very few people, I'm hoping in this world, will look at a Pepsi and say, you know what was her name again? I keep thinking Kylie. It was Kendall. Very few people are going to go into the supermarket and say, you know what, Kendall Jenner drinks that drink. I want to be more like her. I'm going to drink a Pepsi. Very few people do that. But what they do is they take a look at it and they have a choice, and they're like, you know what, I feel good about Pepsi. I might not even know why, and this is why people don't think advertising works, because they can't pinpoint the source. But they'll take a look at the logo and they'll say, I feel good about it. I'm going to make this decision. And it'll be unconscious, but that's what drives the behavior. So again, that's why, you'll always see the product paired with fun. Oftentimes, the product paired with power. These days, power makes you feel good. The idea, when you see power and the idea that you could have power elicits a positive emotion. So take a look at, especially with gender equality these days being like such a hot button issue. See how many commercials feature women and pair them with power, right? And again, if you are somebody who's pushing for gender equality and you see that, you're going to have a positive emotion. You're going to be like, yes, it's about time. Woo, way to go for her. All the while, you're pairing with the car, that they're showing you, so that the next time you have to make a decision, again, you're not going to go back to that commercial and say, that commercial made a good point. I'm going to buy that car. You're going to be surfing cars on the web. You're going to come across whatever brand that car was. You're going to elicit a positive emotion, and you're going to say, I'm probably going to get this one. So again, it's all about positive emotions, and it's a nice little exercise to just kind of try to identify what are the positive emotions? What are those unconditioned stimulus? Is it power? Is it fun? Is it sex that they're using to sell? What is it that they're using to elicit that unconditioned response of that positive emotion? Any other questions, comments? Yep.
I think it's interesting when I saw, or I think of when I think of like one that they tried to attach the positive emotion to it was like the ladies they did the smile. It was like they had something like try them all out, like all the faces that they put. And then I think they said that the money, part of the money that they bought them paid for was going to go for Operation Sauce.
Yeah.
Like the thing to get them.
Yeah, exactly. So things like, like smiles. Who hates a smile, right? Whoever walked by a person smiling in the hallway and thought to themselves, that really ruined my day. Nobody, right? We have positive feelings towards smiles. Donating to charities. Whenever you see somebody say, oh, a portion of the sales is going to donate to charity, whoever, thinks of themselves, oh, those horrible, selfish people donating to a charity. No, you're like, oh, that makes me feel good. And that's also why a lot of companies are very quick to jump on bandwagons, very quick to jump on things that are eliciting positive emotions. So all these polluting companies who 20, 30 years ago could not care about destroying this earth, now all of a sudden they're like, look how green we are. Look how wonderful we are. Everybody likes green now. Everybody likes environment now. So let's attach that to our company. So you'll take a look at it and say, oh, look at them doing something about their carbon footprint. I feel good about that. And immediately that gets paired with their product. Another one that I saw posts online just complaining all over the place about was how many corporations, after ignoring the LGBT QA plus community, all of a sudden had these Pride products, right? It's Pride Month. Here's our new brand of rainbow sneakers, or here's our new fashion line, featuring rainbows. And they had a negative reaction to it because they know they've been ignored for so long. But those companies know that now people have positive feelings towards inclusion, towards accepting people, for who they are. So they're using that now. And even though years before, there was specific advertising campaigns. One specific one that I remember actually seeing a documentary about was that for obese people, for overweight people, it used to be very hard to buy a car that you could get seatbelt extenders for, that you could have room for an obese person, because car manufacturers did not want their car associated with obese people because it wasn't a good image for them. But now you turn on a lot of commercials for for example, fashion magazines, you'll have models of all sizes, because now people have a positive feeling towards let's include everybody. So now they're jumping on that bandwagon. So it can work. It can also backfire. I'll give you one last example. This was from maybe about 10 years ago. Does everybody know the car manufacturer Scion? So Scion, when they were first coming into the market, they spent all this money to be like the young person's car, right? They were going to be the car that if you were a young, teenager, early 20s person, you could buy this car and you can customize it, and you can, in different colors, you can make it personal, you can make it your own. What happened was they had one car that had a door that was super low to the ground. It was kind of like almost like a mini SUV. And the door, when it opened, just the way that they designed it, it was super low to the ground. And the seat was a little bit higher than in a normal car. So you could just kind of open it and you could just kind of step in and sit down, and it was extremely comfortable. What happened was old people loved it, right? They were like, oh my gosh, I don't have to struggle to get in and out of a car. This is wonderful. Where was this my entire life? They bought them like crazy. Young people took one look at all these old people driving these cars, and they saw the stimulus, the neutral stimulus, the Scion automobile, the unconditioned stimulus of age. That causes the unconditioned response of thinking, I'm going to die someday, which is not a positive reaction. And they stayed away from this car like crazy. And it was just like Scion was sitting there going, what happened? And it never really took off. All right, so again, nice little mental exercise. See if you can identify conditioned stimuli, unconditioned stimuli. What is the unconditioned response they're going for? in some of these ads. All right, so we're going to wrap up today with a look at, once again, an explanation for why we are rightfully afraid of bees, why are they an aversive stimulus, but also why somebody who never got bitten by a spider might develop a fear of spiders. So we'll take a look at one explanation for that. And to start it off, it all has to do with the temporal arrangements of stimuli. So we're going to take a look at the 4 types of temporal arrangements. We got delayed conditioning, we got trace conditioning, we got a battery that should have more life, we have simultaneous conditioning, and then lastly, we got backward conditioning. So we'll take a look at delayed conditioning first. So what we're going to take a look at is a few examples of delayed conditioning. We'll start off with the tone and the shock. So that is the schematic for delayed conditioning. We got time here on the y-axis. And then what we have is when the tone begins, that's the neutral stimulus. And then when it ends, and then we have when the shock begins, and when the shock ends, and that's the unconditioned stimulus. So delayed conditioning is when you start the tone, and then before the tone ends, the shock starts, right? That's delayed conditioning. So this little overlap here is the key feature of delayed conditioning. And this is very effective at, it's a very effective setup for classical conditioning. This is where you have a lot of temporal contiguity. Remember that term? These two things occur close together in time, so close they're actually overlapping. So that's highly effective, and you can learn very quickly to react to the tone. The tone turns into a conditioned stimulus very quickly because it's being paired with the unconditioned stimulus of the shock. This is one of the best examples for why we fear bees. The first time we see a bee flying around us is probably a neutral stimulus. But what happens is that it gives out either a noise or you can visually see it. Right? So it's like, zzz, and you're like, oh, look at that bee. Wow, look at that bee. Oh, landed on my arm. Look at that bee. So the stimulus is still there. All of a sudden, the sting occurs, and the bee is still there, right? So that is an example of delayed conditioning. That's very effective. No surprise whatsoever that when people get stung for the first time, they learn to be afraid of that bee. That bee goes from a neutral stimulus, where they're like, it's not so bad, to a conditioned stimulus, where they're like, oh no, I'm going to stay away from it. All right, so the next kind of very common form of classical conditioning way of setting up your neutral stimulus and your unconditioned stimulus is called trace conditioning. Trace conditioning is very much like delayed conditioning, except that now the neutral stimulus, in this case the tone, stops, and then you got a period where nothing occurs, and then the shock occurs. So you got the tone first, you got the shock second, like delayed conditioning, but there's no overlap. This time the tone ends and the shock occurs. This is less effective in general than delayed conditioning. And again, it has to do with temporal contiguity. There's not as much. It's lower temporal contiguity. They happen further apart in time. Now, I say in general that this is more effective. Not always. And the one place that will be very familiar to probably not all of you, but to many of us, where trace conditioning occurs, and it occurs best when there's a delay, has to do with when you eat a new food and it makes you sick and you vomit it all up. So if you ever got food poisoning, what happens is you eat that new food and you're like, oh, this tastes great, this tastes great, this tastes great. You finish, right? Finish your meal. And then hours later, all of a sudden you start vomiting. And vomiting is an unconditioned stimulus. Nobody that I know likes to vomit, right? You have a bad reaction to vomit. You don't have to be trained to not like vomiting. You're there, you're throwing up, and you're like, I hate this. It's an unconditioned stimulus that leads to negative emotions. This trace conditioning is actually best when you have a period of like an hour or 2 hours between the neutral stimulus, the food, and the vomiting. All right, next kind. So the last two kinds aren't very effective, but they do exist, and research has been done on them. Simultaneous conditioning. Simultaneous conditioning is when you have the tone being presented at the same time as the shock. So the neutral stimulus starts when the unconditioned stimulus starts. And this is incredibly ineffective in terms of conditioning the neutral stimulus. And partly it is because the neutral stimulus gives you no information. It's an irrelevant stimulus, right? Because it doesn't predict the shock. It doesn't tell you anything about, it doesn't help your body get prepared for the shock. So it's almost like we are programmed not to associate it with the shock because it's not telling us anything. So this is a very ineffective form of training. All right, and then to wrap it all up, the last one we have is backward conditioning. And as you might imagine, this is where the unconditioned stimulus occurs, and then the neutral stimulus occurs. So in this case, the shock begins, and then a little bit of time afterwards, you hear the tone. The shock is turned off, and the tone keeps going. So it's like, zzz, beep. You're like, whoa. Could have used that information a couple minutes ago. So this is also, in general, a poor form of conditioning. It's a bad way to set up conditioning. It's not effective in terms of us learning to change that tone from a neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. However, there is one exception, and that has to do, well, there's more than one exception, but there's an important exception, and that has to do with fear conditioning. So for reasons that are beyond the scope of this course, this form of conditioning is actually highly effective for fear conditioning. And this might be what is happening when people become afraid of a spider. So one possible explanation, spiders, they usually like dark, secluded places like basements or unlit garages. Basically places where you're going to stumble around and either make a loud noise that's going to startle you, or maybe stub your toe or injure yourself in some other way. So what happens, or what might happen, is you are walking around, in your basement, you're kind of feeling for the light switch, and you knock something over and it makes a loud noise, right? Stuff comes down, crash. And you're like, unconditioned stimulus. We have a negative reaction to loud noise. So you hear the loud noise and you're like, oh my gosh. And then you look up and sure enough, there's a spider. Spider never bit you, but that's an example of backward conditioning. You heard the loud noise, you look up, you see the spider. Spider used to be a neutral stimulus, but through this backwards conditioning, it now has a chance, or it has increased its standing as a conditioned stimulus. So importantly, this is usually completely ineffective. Seems to be most effective for us in humans as fear conditioning. So again, if you just have a fearful experience, unconditioned fearful response, and then you look up and you see a spider, those two together, even though it's backwards, can oftentimes lead to that spider becoming a conditioned stimulus. All right, so that is it for today. So any final questions, comments, anything? All right, so next class, we're going to have our exam. That is all that's going to go on next class. So all you need is a pencil and an eraser. I'll provide everything else, and that is the only thing we're doing next class. So I will see you there. Thank you. If anybody didn't sign in, we got them up here at the front.